If I asked you this question, where are we? What would you do? If we were walking along, or actually we're not walking along, where are we? What do you do?
Look around.
Look around? That's what you do, is to look around. If I ask, where are we? You'd look around. Are you sure about that? What would you do, Gabe?
I would just gesture like here.
Here? Is that helpful to me?
Probably not.
What would you do after you looked around? Willa, would you say something? What would you say?
Here.
That's the same thing Gabe said, except he didn't even have to look around. He just said,
I meant like, are you asking where we are now? Here?
may as well. Let's ask where we are.
I answer you.
Where are we? At Hartwick
Oneonta, New York.
in Oneonta, New York. This is what I would do. I would look at my phone. I would say, and then I'd tell you where we were. I'd have my phone turn on the location systems, which I usually leave off, but all the apps always ask me, can I use your current location? And then I say, sure. And then they say, you can get that at Home Depot just down the street. The phone knows where I am. And so you don't have to do this. You don't look at your phone. You're at Pine Lake, so maybe your phone just goes dead out there. But I just want to know where I am. So I look at my phone and then I see myself on a map and I say, aha, here I am. Huh? Nobody does that? What? Everybody does that. I mean, everybody that I know. Well, maybe nobody looks at their phone to find out where they are.
If you're like driving in another state, maybe.
All right, okay, so this Saturday, there's Accepted Students Day, right?
Yeah.
And they're coming here and they're gonna wanna know where they are and how to get to the next place. How are they gonna do that? They're gonna look on their phones. We used to give them little Hartwick maps. You ever seen a Hartwick map?
Yeah, I remember in freshman year they gave us little maps in our backpacks.
I gave you little maps. And Hartwick is notoriously difficult to map. I should have pulled up one of those old maps. I mean, it's a very strange place to map because it's actually very difficult to map a hill. I mean, everything is kind of on top of each other, and estimating distances is very difficult, and it's hard to map hills on a two-dimensional surface in general, and to know how long it will take to get from Anderson to here, how difficult it will be, how out of breath you might be when you actually arrive here is difficult to convey on a map. Well, Willa says she doesn't look at her phone, which is good. So we're going to do all of this as if we're going to do this chapter at first as it was written in the pre-phone days, the pre-GPS days, as I think Ingold intended it to be, which was when we used to look at paper maps, although those were fed into GPS. So in the pre-phone days, you would look at your map of campus and you'd look at the sign on the door and you'd say, we are in Jaeger 321A. Why didn't anybody tell me that? I mean, that's what I have to tell students when we know where to be for reasons that we'll talk about at the end you probably don't even know this is Jaeger 321A. So we're gonna have all these students looking around at their maps, or they used to. They used to look around at their maps, and then you'd come around and you'd look for a building, and they might get lost. And now you can get from place to place on campus probably without getting lost, and you don't need the map. How often have you pulled that little map out of your backpack since first year? Never. You don't need it. Why don't you need the map anymore?
Is that like a general sense of where everything is now?
A general sense of where everything is now. Yeah. Now, we don't get lost because we have a sense. And in the words, or the worldview of the, I don't know what to call them, the psychologists, the idea is the reason you don't get lost is because you have copied that map. That map that was once in your backpack has sort of been copied into your head, so that it now exists as a mental map. And that general sense of direction is in fact the mental map that you use to navigate all the way around. It's just in your head instead of in your hand. There it is. According to a view that has found wide support in the literatures of geography and psychology, there's no difference in principle between the person who has a map and doesn't. Both are map users. For both, knowing where one is means identifying one's position in the world with a location on the map. The difference is just that the native inhabitants map, and we'll call you native inhabitants of Hartwick now since you had to be here over spring break, is held not in the hand, but in the head, preserved not on paper, but in memory, in the form of a comprehensive spatial representations of their usual surroundings. At any moment, it is supposed they can access this mental or cognitive map and determine their location in terms of it. So there you have it. You have copied the map into your head, and now you don't need it. It can stay in your backpack and you can still know where you are at all times. So this is the mental map idea. And it comes to us from some experiments that were done with rats and bees. You have to feel for the poor rats. When you type in rats into PowerPoint, they just give you this image, rats in a maze. It's like they have to be there. They're always in mazes, apparently. Mice. I don't even know if that's a rat. That looks more like a mouse, doesn't it? All right, so there were these experiments that the psychologists did. They like doing these things with the rats. And so they made a maze. You'd make a maze, you starve them, or make them hungry. They're so mean. They're so mean to the rats. So mean. We used to do things to the rats too. There was a psychologist here who did, I don't know if they're still doing things to the rats, but it always kind of freaked me out. They'd be like removing parts of their brains and stuff. It's very sad. So they come up with this maze, make them hungry, put something that they want to eat in, and then they have to take all these turns out to get to the food. Now the rats are very smart. Once had a rat as a pet, went down to buy a pet for the kids, and they wanted a gerbil, but there were no gerbils. So they said, this is a great thing, it's a rat. Should have researched this a little bit more before I took it home, because rats are very social creatures. And anybody ever had a rat for a pet? Yeah, it's alike. They're very smart and they're very social. So we were not good. We're not the best rat. We should have bought 2 of them, I think. So when presented with this maze, what was the first thing the rats did? When they were presented with this maze and the food, and they had to take all these twists and turns to get to the food. Yeah, the first thing they did is just climb up on top and run straight across. Like, screw this maze, man. We need some food. We're gonna climb straight across. So then they, probably nailed that thing down. So they make sure those rats stay in the maze. Say, this is probably a picture of a rat that's not been nailed down. They had to make them stay in the maze. And so then they get them used to that maze. And then one morning, they wake up and they're in a different thing. And they have all these doors in front of them. What did they do? Wake up one morning and all of a sudden you have all these routes, and the route you would normally take, you go out there and you run into a wall. Boom. So you go back and you got like 10 doors to choose from. More. 18 doors to choose from. What do they do? They found the right one. Most of the time, they'd never been there. They'd never been down it, but most of them just found it and went straight to the food along the designated route. It's incredible. Same with the bees. They take these bees, put them in one place, fly them out to the food. Then at night, take a darkened structure, move it, take the lid off. The bees fly right to the food again. Incredible skills of navigation. So the idea was that there's some sort of cognitive, well, actually, no. The idea was that people have this cognitive map, but the bees, how could the bees have this? This is on page 222. But how big are, we know rats are intelligent, but how big are the brains of bees? I don't think they do. If they do, I don't think, I mean, I like bees and all, but they're not really known for having complex cognitive skills. This is on page 222. This is Oatley, who says that whatever the conditions under which is carried out, navigation is a complex cognitive skill. Then Ingold says, comparing what the Goulds say about bees with what Oatley says about humans, we find more than a hint of double standards. Confronted with essentially the same task, its successful accomplishment by humans is attributed to complex skills, whereas bees apparently do it on autopilot. I do not mean to deny that human wayfinding is a highly complex skilled process, but there seems good reason to suppose that it is skilled precisely to the extent that it goes beyond the simple computational operations described by the cognitive map theorists. It's not a maze. You need a lot more. So basically, what Ingold is saying here is that all these creatures, animals and non-human animals and humans, are wayfinding, but not because of the complex cognitive map that has been implanted in the head. In fact, Ingold is pretty clear. One of his simpler sentences, people accuse Ingold of having too many, of not being able to understand. There it is. There is no such map. Well, that's not this whole sentence, but it's 5 important words, all of one single syllable. So what Ingold is saying in this chapter, and he kind of has it at the beginning and at the end, and in between things get more complicated, but that there isn't a map that is in the head, and that when we know things, it's more that when knowledge is like a map, but it's not, our knowledge is like mapping, but it's not map-like. And so he comes to the conclusion that what we're doing as we move through an environment is we have a general sense of things because we've done them before, and we go along and we are, again, wrapping over to the very end, that we know as we go, not before we go. That's not to say we can't imagine what's going to happen and we have memories of what has happened already, but we are constantly orienting ourselves in relationship to our environments in the context, as Ingold says on page 230, in the very course of their moving about it. So we're not about in it. So we're not trying to map it up to some sort of mental map that corresponds to what the paper things are. And what Ingold's, again, we can sort of bounce back and forth between 219, 220, where he lays out his thesis in a nutshell and his thesis at the very end, is that what we do is not navigation, but a process of wayfinding. And that this wayfinding is more like storytelling or a performance or something like music, and being able to have musical passages following each other. Sometimes these would be written down, in which case they might be following something what we might call as a map, but that the map itself, like the score, isn't the music. The music is doing the actual thing. I thought to sort of bring in a comparison here with Bonilla, and when they're going to be doing this different union tactics, the hunger strike of Michel Matasami, they say that the union are employing strategies like a guaca dance, that they have inherent chaos and syncopation at their center, and the leadership's genius lies in their ability to channel that chaos into a coherent pattern of action. They're like guaca dancers carving a rhythmic dance out of the polyphonic beats of the ka drum, taming the drum with their movements. So a little, I think, perhaps beginning of an interesting potential parallel between Ingold and Bonilla here, and how people work through different situations. It's actually not according to a pre-existing schema or cognitive map, but according to how people improvise and draw this together with their bodies and music as they go along. There's some really, I think, super interesting passages here. In the ones I find the most interesting are kind of in the middle from page 231 through 235, where Ingold's talking about, again, drawing on this idea that mapping is more like a genre of artistic performance or storytelling. He gives the example, drawing on Dennis Wood, of boys playing rollerblade hockey. Is that what they're doing? They are. Their two boys have been playing rollerblade hockey. So one of them goes home and over dinner is tracing out the contours of what happens in the court on a placemat with his hands. And there's nothing left, of course, because dinner is over and the placemat is not there. But the other one does the same gestures on a piece of paper at school. And in that case, you have basically an artifact that then you could talk about. So what Ingold is saying here is both of them are doing the same thing. They're both doing this kind of storytelling, but in one case there's been an inscription, and in the other case not. And so he says on page 233 that most maps in human society are improvised on the spot. And we're always pointing at things. That's what you were doing before. Here we are. pointing at things, showing people where to go. They're improvised on the spot. They might be drawn on something, but as soon as you get there, you throw it away. Most maps have been made in the sand or the snow, right? They're not meant to be permanent. They're meant to be ephemeral. And so a lot of the so-called maps that we would have, it would be our gestures or our traces in the world. And when we then show it to someone, then they themselves would gesture and trace upon it to show us their own journey. And then, you know, he's contending that a lot of this, that a lot of the so-called maps and written records in the Middle Ages were more like reminders rather than representations. It actually reminds me of, I think, the best way to take notes in class, which I think you all do probably well enough. You're not trying to capture everything. That's crazy. So you sort of write things down to remind yourself of what happened. So it helps you to remember or to recall and to relive, if needed, that social situation. On pages 234 and 235, Ingold then contrasts that with the, you know, the sort of what we might call the perfect modern map, the thing that's on paper where if you make a line on it or you gesture, then you're not making the map, you're defacing the map. And so you need to erase it to make sure that it's excluded from the map, because the map has to be this pure representation of the world. And so then over on to page 235, he talks about how, you know, in the old days, the maps also included all this artistic stuff. There might be ships and waves and people, and those were considered to be part of the thing. It wasn't supposed to be necessarily a separate idea. But over time, this is on page 235, art, in the words of Brian Harley, was gradually edged off the map. But to edge art off the map is also to edge human actor perceivers off the world, to push their direct sensory experience into the wings, and to consign their narratives of movement and travel to the realms of fable, fantasy, and hallucination. And in some ways, of course, this chapter might be read well together with Brody, because that's exactly what happens to the indigenous maps that they were making. They're consigned to the realms of fantasy, fable, and hallucination because they are seen as artistic more than what Brody had to do was basically to recover this, to make gestures on a map and to make those into the representation of hunting territories, because if not, people wouldn't believe that was what the indigenous people were doing. Again, in part because gesturing and the inscription becomes a defacing of what we think of as the real map. So we get to the end of things and we re-ask the question, where are we? Well, what would you tell those prospective students? If you were here, what would you tell them if they said, where are we? What would you say? You wouldn't be able to say, here we are. That's not an option to you. Of course, they know they're here. What do you say? Here they are. What do you say to them? I have to talk to them on Saturday. What am I going to say? They're not going to come here. I have to go up there. Where are we now? We're in the anthropology floor. We are in the heart of anthropology, I would say. How many classes have you had here? Like, many classes. What's the best thing that's ever happened to you here? What do you most remember about here? I try not to be here that much. I usually try to be in places that are in windows, so I can't. Let's see, have we ever been here together? Not until now. We've been everywhere, but not here, because I like windows. Huh?
Were you here for peoples and cultures of Latin America and Caribbean?
Yes, we were here for that, except that one we were able to open it up and we had the huge room all to ourselves during J-Track. Wasn't that true? Yes, that was the huge opening room. Actually, those were the good days. We had a big room. Now we're back in this little tiny room. There you go. So the answer, Ingold says, is yeah, if you are with someone and you both don't know where you are, then you are likely to consult some kind of map or your phone, even though Willa says nobody does that. If you had no idea. Exactly. You're traveling with someone who has no idea and we're miles away from anything we've ever known, then you would consult something like that. You'd consult an artifact. But if you're with someone who is your friend and has never been here and they ask you where you are, the answer is not a number or even a place. The answer is a story or something that has happened there and the movements that you have made in that place. So from here, I have gone up and gotten coffee and I have visited the museum, etc. So that if we then go back to page 219, places do not have locations but histories. So we may actually have no idea of our location in space in terms of its directionality, but we know exactly where we are because we've traveled through here and been through here and had stories here before. Interestingly, Gabe, what would happen if you were suddenly transported into the map that you were once carrying around in your backpack? If you got put inside that map, what would happen?
You'd lose a lot of the context from like the real world because you're going from 3D to 2D. You like lose like the air, even you lose depth, you lose all your senses pretty much.
You'd lose all your senses. Yeah, this is, in page 242, says if we were transported into the map, we wouldn't know where we were. We'd be lost. And interestingly, and this may have happened actually one time when I was teaching this class. There was a sudden snowstorm, as is often the case in April. And it was spooky. It was like, the world was standing still and there was all this snow and people were lost, even though they lived around here for a long time. Ever happened to you? Eclipses, storms. Couldn't get back to Pine Lake. That was a tree. The night of the thunderstorm. So that we need all those details. When nothing moves, there's nothing to which one can respond at such times as before a storm or during an eclipse. The experienced traveler can lose their bearings even in familiar terrain. So, all good. Now, in the middle of the chapter is something that I have become accustomed to skipping over because it's too hard for me. It's when Ingold is talking about, is having a discussion with David Turnbull about the maps and about the status of science. And I thought I almost grasped it this time around, and then it left me again when I looked at it. I thought I understood what he was talking about. Turnbull is a sociologist of science, and I think that Ingold likes a lot of what Turnbull has to say about maps, and this book, I think, would be in and of itself an interesting thing to look at, especially if you like looking at pictures of maps and map making. So he likes a lot of it because what Turnbull seems to be saying is that maps can't be, that there is not a map that can actually be separated from cultural practices. So that even our attempts at so-called scientific representation of the world depend upon a particular way of life in that world. And that modern science is a product of our cultural understandings. I think that Ingold likes that part. I think he also likes that how what Turnbull is saying is that the modern scientific map has tried to eliminate the art and has tried to eliminate the producers and tried to eliminate the context of production. I think he agrees with that as well. The reason why I think there are some disagreements which are, for me, are difficult to understand, but I think they're in line with what Ingold has been arguing previously, because what Turnbull seems to be saying is that all maps are the products or can't be separated out from their cultural system and their cultural production. But on page 225, he says that, he says that basically modern maps have to take into account, quote, the worldview, cognitive schema, or the culture of the map maker. And if you think about cognitive schema and the culture of the map maker in that sense, you can probably know that that's where Ingold has been kind of blasting us with this idea that there's not such a thing as a culture or a cognitive schema that exists outside of the bodily context and the environment in which it's produced. So I think his main issue with Turnbull is not necessarily the empirical work or the ideas he had, but that in some ways what Turnbull ends up doing is, like we've talked about before, is reproducing this idea that in some ways all people have culture, or all people have these culture schemas, mental models, which we're then going to compare from a bird's eye view above. So again, it's not, when Ingold is talking about indexicality and you can be indexical in relationship, I get a little bit lost. But I think that, if we concentrate on this, the idea of knowing as we go and being located within a world, we may be able to get something out of it, or it corresponds with what I think our critique has been already, without wanting to take anything away from Turnbull and others. All right, now I want to take on the phones, the GPSs, the things that are in our hands sometimes. So I've been trying to think about this. On the one hand, I think that things have changed enormously since Ingold wrote this, right? I mean, it used to be that Ingold was talking about maps and cartography, and now we call up maps, or we can call up maps all the time. We can call up these very, it's as if the map is telling us where to go, or it's talking to me and telling me where to go as I go about. And so it seems like this is the idea of navigation in the sense of in the sense of almost being back to the rats in a maze kind of navigation, and the mental map has actually been reproduced into our hands. And like I said, I'm getting told what to do. Turn right, turn around, go for 20 miles, then stop on this street. And now it tells me what street it is and where I am exactly in space. And so I think this is the way that many of us experience the map. So on the one hand, I feel like there's been an intensification of that detachment or the navigational idea, which has been really implanted, so that if I read correctly, people say that you shouldn't use these in their car if you really want to know where you're going, because you'll be much better off just kind of driving along and looking instead of having this thing talk to you all the time, which I can't. That's hard for me not to do, or to do, but that's what they say you should do. So on the one hand, the navigational impulse has only been magnified 100 times since Ingold wrote this chapter. On the other hand, I wonder if, I mean, Ingold says that most maps are gestures or drawings that we throw away, or ephemeral things that we threw away. I don't know if you remember when the mapping first came out, the computerized form, we didn't have phones. We used to type the directions into the computer at home and print it out. Your parents ever do this? You have the directions printed out, and then you take that with you. And pretty soon your car would be filled with all these crappy, they used to have all these directions around, and, every so often you'd have to throw them all away because it didn't make any sense anymore. It was just too many. So I started to wonder if the GPS itself has in some ways made these maps even more ephemeral. It's like we can call them up and then they disappear, and we imagine things and trips and then they're gone again. They're as ephemeral as they once were.